Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about one of the most fascinating characters in ancient history, Spartacus. Let's dive into the story of this gladiator who became a symbol of the fight against oppression. Spartacus led the most successful slave revolt in Roman history, known as the Third Servile War, between 73 and 71 before the Common Era. This was the last of three major slave revolts that Rome faced and suppressed. Before we continue, please like and subscribe to the channel. This way you'll stay up to date with history. The story of Spartacus has been told by historians, novelists, and filmmakers to this day, but admiration for this hero of the Third Servile War is not something new. Stanley Kubrick's famous film from 1960, Spartacus, based on Howard Fast's novel, portrayed Spartacus as a freedom fighter, leading his people against the oppressive system of Roman slavery. All representations of the rebel gladiator that came after Kubrick's film followed this line, to a greater or lesser degree. However, the real Spartacus was not a hero of his people fighting for their freedom. He was simply a man who had endured enough of the Roman institution of slavery, and one day decided he would endure no more. Spartacus's revolt began more or less as an accident. According to the historian Plutarch, who lived between the years 45 and 120 of the Common Era, the gladiators' original plan was simply to escape. However, once this plan was discovered, they had no choice but to fight for their freedom or submit to execution. The real motivations behind Spartacus's revolt do not diminish his achievements. They became irrelevant from the 18th century in France when the gladiator was elevated to iconic status as an enemy of oppression and champion of freedom. Since then, the terrible living conditions as a slave in ancient Rome have been compared to those of any group suffering oppression, and Spartacus is the most recognizable hero of the ancient world to serve as a symbol. But let's go back to the year 73 before the Common Era. At that time, Spartacus seems to have had no motivation other than his own freedom and escaping the punishments he could expect from his masters. Slavery was widespread in ancient Rome, and the Romans greatly feared an uprising of their lowest working class. Rome's economy depended mainly on agriculture and war. Agriculture sustained the population, while military campaigns generated the funds needed for various other necessities. The soldiers used in these campaigns were farmers who were kept in the army for increasingly long periods as Rome expanded its conquests. Their farms often went bankrupt and their lands were then bought by the rich, who used slaves to work them. Slaves were used for a wide variety of tasks throughout Rome, from field work to domestic work, tutoring children in reading, writing, music, and other arts, personal attendance, and any other work they could fill. They were completely at the mercy of their master. Cruel treatment of slaves was so widespread that it came to be considered natural. It was necessary to break the will of slaves as individuals to have an obedient servant who met the expectations of a slave in Roman society. Slave labor meant greater leisure and profit for those who owned slaves, but these slaves were only profitable if they were submissive and did what they were told without question or hesitation. It's important to note that not all slaves were mistreated. Some were treated well by their masters and would give their lives to safeguard that master's house, property, and life. Two famous philosophers were slaves, Diogenes of Sinope in Greece and Epictetus in Rome, and both were treated as family members. However, these are notable exceptions to the general rule, and most slaves endured difficult lives with little hope of gaining their freedom and no rights before the law. Over time, there were more slaves than free people in Rome. The unemployment rate rose sharply as more and more slaves were used for jobs that Roman citizens used to occupy, and the countryside around the city of Rome became increasingly a vast network of slave colonies residing on large plantations of the very wealthy. Slaves who were not employed in domestic or agricultural work were used as gladiators in the arena. If the life of the domestic slave was bad, that of the gladiator was worse. The gladiator was a slave whose sole purpose was to fight for the entertainment of Roman crowds. Gladiators were usually men, although there were some women, and could gain freedom through exceptional feats, but most often they lived and died as slaves in the arena. Spartacus was a Thracian, originally from a region north of Macedonia, which was considered by both Greeks and Romans to be uncivilized and barbaric. However, Plutarch describes Spartacus as more Greek than Thracian, and notes that he was exceptionally intelligent and highly educated. Nothing is known about his youth or how he became a slave of Rome. The main sources on Spartacus's revolt are the historians Appian, Florus, and Plutarch, who selected the details they found most suitable from the earlier works on the revolt by Sallust and Livy, both now existing only in fragments. According to Appian, he was a Thracian who once fought against the Romans and, after being taken prisoner and sold, became a gladiator. Florus states that he was a Roman mercenary in the legions who was arrested for desertion and theft before being selected as a gladiator thanks to his strength. Plutarch gives a similar account of Spartacus as a mercenary of Rome, but adds that he was captured along with his wife after deserting. His wife is described as a prophetess of his people who escaped with Spartacus during the revolt and traveled with his army afterwards, probably dying with him in the final confrontation with Rome. Regardless of how he was captured and for what reasons, his military and physical training made him a perfect candidate for the arena. Spartacus is described by all ancient sources as tall and exceptionally strong. He was bought by a Roman nobleman named Lentulus Batiatus and sent to a gladiator school south of Rome in Capua. In 73 before the Common Era, Spartacus and some other conspirators devised a plan to escape from the compound and head north in search of freedom beyond the Apennines. This plan included more than 200 other slaves, and with so many involved, it was no surprise when the news leaked to the authorities. Spartacus knew they would be tortured before being killed, and therefore led 78 of his fellow slaves in a revolt. They raided the kitchen and armed themselves with knives and spits, and then assassinated their instructors and captors. Once free, they found more weapons in the storerooms and a transport wagon, and then fled from the school to the nearby countryside, where they camped somewhere on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. There, they elected Spartacus, Ennomius, and Crixus as their leaders, although the slaves elected 3 leaders. Each ancient source states that Spartacus soon became the supreme commander. News of the revolt spread quickly, and many of the slaves from plantations throughout the country left their homes and joined the rebels. The Roman Senate considered all this more of a nuisance than a threat, and sent a force of largely untrained soldiers under the command of General Gaius Claudius Glaber to solve the problem. Glaber and the Senate seem to have thought that a group of runaway slaves would be easily defeated, as they could not possibly know anything about military tactics or warfare. However, Spartacus surprised them. Glaber surrounded the slaves in their camp on the mountainside, keeping them confined and prepared to starve them into submission. The mountain, however, was thick with vine branches, and Spartacus ordered his men to weave them into ladders by which they could descend through an area that Glaber had neglected, considering it inaccessible, and attack from behind Glaber's lines, defeating him and looting the camp for weapons. A second force was then sent against the slaves, led by Publius Varinius, who chose to divide his forces, perhaps hoping to catch his enemy off guard and crush them. Whatever his plan was, it is unknown, but his failure was enormous. Varinius's army was defeated and scattered. Spartacus's victory was so complete that Varinius lost even the horse he had ridden into battle. After these 2 victories, more slaves left their masters' houses and joined the revolt. The Roman Senate realized that they had seriously underestimated Spartacus, who now commanded an army of more than 70,000 former slaves, and summoned the consuls Publicola and Clodianus to lead their forces against him. Spartacus now controlled the countryside, with new recruits joining his cause almost daily. There was no doubt now that he posed a significant threat to Rome. However, Spartacus had no intention of marching on Rome. He led his army northward, out of Italy, to cross the Apennines and allow his followers to return to their homes. His force was too large to move at once, so he divided it into 2 and put his second in command, Crixus, in charge of one of them. The Romans under Publicola attacked Crixus's forces, while Clodianus attacked Spartacus's contingent. Crixus's forces were repelled with heavy losses, but Spartacus defeated Clodianus and then drove Publicola from the field. Crixus was killed in the battle, and Spartacus honored him by sacrificing 300 Roman prisoners, according to Appian. He then held his own gladiatorial games, using the remaining Roman prisoners for the spectacle. There is no record of why Spartacus abandoned his plan to lead his forces to freedom by leaving Italy, but for whatever reason, the ever-growing army of former slaves now marched south. 2 more armies were sent against Spartacus, and he defeated both. Publicola and Clodianus were withdrawn by the Senate, and a new supreme commander, Marcus Licinius Crassus, was summoned. Crassus marched against Spartacus in Bruttium, at the southern tip of Italy. Spartacus's plan was to work with the pirates of Cilicia to take over the Roman-occupied island of Sicily and turn it into a free nation for his followers. The pirates were supposed to have met him on the coast of Bruttium, but they never arrived. Crassus made his army of more than 32,000 soldiers move quickly and build a wall that trapped Spartacus behind it. Crassus felt confident in waiting for his opponent, since Spartacus, with the sea behind him and the wall in front, had nowhere to go. Spartacus tried to escape but was repelled with the loss of more than 6,000 of his men. The Roman Senate, however, felt that Crassus was not moving fast enough and brought in the famous general Pompey, the conqueror of Spain. Crassus intensified his attacks to defeat Spartacus before Pompey could arrive and steal his glory. Spartacus, seeing an opportunity to divide the Roman generals before Pompey's arrival, asked to negotiate terms with Crassus, but was refused. Seeing that there was no hope, Spartacus gathered his men and, according to Plutarch, when his horse was brought to him, he drew his sword and killed it, saying that the enemy had many good horses that would be his if he won, and if he lost, he wouldn't need a horse anyway. He led his army for the last time into battle, and Plutarch writes, went straight for Crassus himself, advancing through the press of weapons and wounded men. And although he did not reach Crassus, he cut down 2 centurions who fell upon him together. Finally, when his own men had fled, he himself, surrounded by enemies, stood firm and died fighting to the end. Appian writes, Spartacus himself was wounded in the thigh by a spear but fell to his knees, held his shield in front of him and fought against his attackers until he and a large number of his followers were surrounded and fell. And Florus comments, Spartacus himself fell as befits a general, fighting bravely in the front rank. Appian and Plutarch note that his body was never identified. Although Crassus defeated Spartacus in the field, the glory for the victory went to Pompey. Pompey arrived when the battle was ending and his troops faced the fleeing slaves who fled the field. Plutarch writes that Pompey in his dispatch to the Senate could say that, although Crassus had certainly conquered the slaves in open battle, he himself had uprooted the war by eliminating anyone who might have continued the fight. The 6,000 survivors of Spartacus's army were then crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua, and their bodies left there to rot for years as a warning against any future insurrections. Although early Roman historians saw him as a dangerous rebel and criminal, all their accounts show a reluctant and sometimes outright respect for the gladiator general. A war against slaves was considered dishonorable, and the fact that Spartacus had prolonged the conflict so successfully for so long was especially difficult for Roman pride. The story of Spartacus is fascinating and has had a lasting impact on popular culture. After his death in the final battle against Crassus's forces, the slave revolt was effectively ended. However, Spartacus's legacy endured. In the centuries that followed, Spartacus became a symbol of resistance against oppression and the struggle for freedom. His story inspired many revolutionary movements and was used as an example of leadership and courage in the face of adversity. In the modern era, Spartacus has been portrayed in various media, including literature, theater, and film. Howard Fast's novel and the subsequent Stanley Kubrick film, Spartacus, helped solidify his image as a revolutionary hero in 20th century popular culture. It's important to note that although Spartacus is often romanticized, the precise details of his life and motivations remain largely unknown. Historical sources are limited and often contradictory. Did you like the video? Then leave your like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.